Hi there, Worldview 2 class. This is your video about Thomas Hobbes and his political masterpiece, Leviathan. All right? So, the first thing is the reputation of Leviathan. It's a very controversial book, just like Machiavelli's The Prince, and as you'll see, there's a lot of similarities between the two. But some consider it to be the greatest political work of all time. I think that's an exaggeration, but you might see why some thought so. So his reputation, or rather the reputation of Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, is very, very extensive. If you look at the front of your packet, you'll notice a large creature. This creature is holding a sword in one hand and a religious scepter in the other, signifying that one power controls both the state and the church, and this will be significant. There are a lot of other things that are representative about the body of this person. For instance, the soul represents sovereignty, the power, the sovereign, the king. The joints of the body represent the officials, that which holds it together. The nerves represent reward and punishment. Strength represents wealth and riches. Memory represents counselors. Reason and will represent equity and laws. Health represents the concord of the kingdom. Sickness is sedition or traitorous behavior. Death of the body is civil war. And pacts and covenants are the equivalent of God saying, "Let us make man." So basically, God said, "Let us make man." Man says, "Let us make government." Now, knowing that Leviathan and The Prince are very similar political works, although they have some differences, I want you to answer the following questions in your packet on your own, and then we'll talk about them in class and see if you were right. Feel free to come back and answer these questions as we go through. To whom is the state accountable? How far does the state's power reach? What is the source of all laws? What about the right to private property? What about work? What power is given to the sovereign? What is Hobbes' view of education? And what if change is needed in the structure of the government? What if there needs to be a new government? These are very interesting questions, and Hobbes gives some very interesting answers. But go ahead and give your best shot now. So he makes an analogy also between the Ten Commandments, or rather the first five of the Ten Commandments. The first commandment is, "You shall have no other gods," which his equivalent is, "You shall have no other governments." He also says, "You shall have no graven images," which means basically that your public life is greater than your private life. To Hobbes, your private life is an idol that gets in the way of your public service. Number 3, you shall not take the Lord your God's name in vain. Don't criticize the government. Number 4, keep the Sabbath day holy. He thought there should be special days to celebrate the government and the king. Number 5, honor your father and mother. Honor the state. Be obedient to them. What do you think Hobbes thought about religious freedom based on what you see here? Do you think that he thought you should have religious freedom, or did he believe in a one religion run by the state? Now let's shift and talk a little bit about the life of Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes was born during the reign of Queen Elizabeth in Longsbury, England on April 5th, 1588, on a Friday. He was raised without a father. His father was a preacher who assaulted a man and then ran away to avoid the law. This had some significant impacts on Hobbes, as we'll see, but just know that about his background right now. He grew up in a very historical period. He lived through part of the reign of Queen Elizabeth and all of the reign of James I, also the reign of Charles I. So he lived through some of England's, I guess you could say, more controversial kings and queens. Remember, Queen Elizabeth was rather moderate in comparison, but James I and Charles I did not always get along with Parliament. You might remember that Charles I instituted a period called the 11-year tyranny, in which he did not call Parliament to order. Because remember, Parliament did not come to order unless the king called Parliament to order. So, during the reign of King James had two basic principles, and King James reigned from 1603 to 1625. These two basic principles were, number 1, the divine right of kings, or God has given me the right to rule, therefore I will rule. And number 2, the prince's opinion is law. Which of these things is like Machiavelli and which is not? I'll leave that up to you to answer on your packet. The sovereign had multiple tools at his disposal in order to subjugate his kingdom. He could force taxes, force loans. Sometimes he had to have Parliament's permission. Sometimes he did it anyway. in which Parliament would get upset. That's why you end up with some civil wars. You also have martial law, as in basically it's a time of war and the king has instituted the army as the law. Number 3, the quartering and the billeting of soldiers. And number 4, imprisonment, good old-fashioned imprisonment. So in response to some of these things that the kings would do, Parliament did not like this. And so in 1628, during the reign of Charles I, the English Parliament sent something called the Petition of Rights. It included 2 important characteristics. These 2 important characteristics are habeas corpus, which means in Latin just cause, which means you cannot imprison somebody without a just cause. So if I'm the king and I don't like you, I can't just say, you're in prison. I have to charge you with a legitimate crime. I can't charge you with a crime of, I don't like him, or I think he's ugly. You have to have a legitimate crime with which you are charged. This is part of our Constitution today. Also, the Parliament, in that Petition of Rights, said, hey, we don't want taxation without representation, which ironically they denied to the American colonists about 140 years later. Very strange. But these were some of the principles that were being discussed during the life of Thomas Hobbes. Now, obviously, you can think what he thought about these things. If he thinks that the prince should have all power, well, why in the world would habeas corpus and representation be needed? And it's also important to note that the sovereign in his case is not always a king. For instance, the sovereign could be Parliament. Sovereign could be whatever government is in place at the time, which for Hobbes was in some instances the king, in some instances Parliament, etc. Hobbes was not a big fan of democracy. He did not think it a viable option for government, and he based this on his view of the Roman Republic. All right, he studied ancient classics pretty well and decided that because the Roman democracy had failed, that democracy was foolish and not worth anybody's time. Okay, Hobbes had a very interesting philosophy that was impacted by geometry. If you've taken geometry, you know that it's based on self-evident truths. For instance, all right angles are equal, a straight line is 180 degrees, etc. He wanted to apply this to all aspects of life. He wanted to reduce everything to self-evident propositions, and so he decided to try to do this with government and politics. This is a big part of his book, Leviathan. Later on in Hobbes' life, he ended up fleeing to France. It's kind of interesting because he thought he was threatened, because in his mind, he was this very influential political writer, but we don't actually have any indication historically that he was ever threatened. It seems that he thought he was threatened and decided to just leave England and go for France. Whether he was threatened or not, we don't know. But history kind of indicates that he might have had a somewhat overinflated view of himself, and so he thought his importance was a little exaggerated. But the reason he fled to France at this time was because in 1640, you had basically the beginnings of the English Revolution, okay? And he was not really on the side of Parliament at the time, and so he thought that, they're going to come after me. Which they did with some people, but again, we don't have any indication that that ever happened to Hobbes. So Hobbes then tried to, while he was in France, write, and he tried to apply his principles of geometry to politics, as we mentioned earlier. He wanted to find as many self-evident truths that he possibly could. So, in doing this, he wrote the book Leviathan. What is the purpose of Leviathan? The overall purpose of Leviathan is actually to oppose religious arguments from Protestants and rebels. Okay? So, the king and the rebels against the king during the English Civil War both argued that God was on their side, of course, as many do in wars. And Hobbes said, no, hey, this is ridiculous. God is on nobody's side. Hobbes was not an atheist, really, but he thought that doctrine was beyond natural reason. Right? To him, religion, or the existence of God, was not a self-evident truth. And so he said, why even argue about it? So he could probably best be described as an agnostic, not an atheist. What about you? Do you think that the existence of God is a self-evident truth or not? This is something we'll be discussing in class. So, in talking about religion and his view of religion, he thought that, hey, because religion is something that you can't really prove, at least not with self-evident truths according to Hobbes, then you should simply let the sovereign decide what religion should be followed. So he would be a big fan of King Henry VIII, for instance. So he demanded, and he said society demanded, uniformity. Basically, that you should neglect your personal beliefs and follow the beliefs of the state. He didn't have a problem if you disagreed with the state personally, but thought that your public life should match up with what the government was saying. So if you think that this is similar to later forms of communism or former forms of despotism, it certainly is, and there's a lot of similarities between the two there. He also had some very strange beliefs about the epistemology of religion and who should be the head of religion. As we already mentioned before, he believed that the king should be the head of the church, that he should rule all things, because he saw religion largely as a tool to be used either for the king or against the people in certain circumstances. He had very strange beliefs. He did not believe in the Holy Spirit, angels, miracles, or anything supernatural, so he might also be classified as a deist. Again, he didn't deny the existence of God, but thought that the existence of God was not something that could be known. Okay? He also really just kind of hated religion in his own personal beliefs, right? He thought that the English Civil War was caused by Presbyterians, whom he called behemoths. He thought that liberty of religion, the ability to choose your own religion, was a bad idea and that it should be avoided, and that it was the cause of all sorts of political and military strife. So he felt very strongly about these things, and he also had some strange beliefs about the common man. As we stated before, he basically thought that the common man should not really be respected that much, that it was all about society as a whole, not the individual man. Okay? He called the writings of the Protestant Reformation a behemoth, as I referenced earlier. The spread of the Reformation was very wide by this point. Remember, by this point, we've already had Calvin, Zwingli, Luther, Huss, Wycliffe, etc. And so there were lots of writings that really were starting to shift public opinion, but not all of public opinion had been shifted yet. The Reformation had done a lot, but there was still a lot of work to be done. I also want to ask you, how much do you think that Hobbes' relationship with his father, or lack of relationship with his father, influenced his beliefs about the Bible? Do you think that there's a connection there, or do you think it's a coincidence? We'll talk about that in class. Hobbes' opinion of the Catholic Church was not very high, which, to be fair, he didn't think much of the Protestants either. He claimed that anybody who says they're inspired by God is wrong, that there is no such a thing as the supernatural. He said that the Pope was a fairy of sorts, that his power came from nothing. So he was very much down on the Catholic Church. He actually called it the kingdom of darkness, which is a little extreme, although we criticize the Catholic Church. I think he's even more heavy-handed with his rejection of it. A few interesting things about Hobbes. You might be thinking, okay, since Hobbes was so big on the king having all this power, well, surely he agreed in the divine right to rule. But then you just heard about how he didn't really necessarily even believe in God. Didn't disbelieve in him, but didn't believe him either. So he rejected the divine right to rule, and instead accepted a type of form of the social contract theory, which is something that we're going to talk about a lot with John Locke. Basically, the social contract theory, in short, is the view that everybody who lives in a society has an unspoken agreement, a social contract, with each other. Now, John Locke, had a very different view of the social contract theory, but it starts in the same place in many ways as Hobbes does. So, after all of this, there is one instance in which Hobbes said that the people could be free from their sovereign. Basically, there was one thing that the sovereign was supposed to do, and if he did not do that, then the people could be free from him. Okay? They could be free from him if he was unable to defend them. He said this was the one obligation that the king had to his people. Notice any similarities with Machiavelli yet? And in doing so, he basically, if he defended them, he had the right to do whatever he wanted. If he was unable to defend them, then the people had the right to change the government, either by accepting a new government that came in or by creating their own government as a result. Hobbes was a lot of different things. He's certainly an empiricist because he doesn't believe in anything supernatural. If you need to, look up empiricist and write down what it means. He's also a materialist. It doesn't mean he's materialistic, but it means that he only believes in the material things, not the supernatural. Some call him an atheist, but again, he's really more of an agnostic here. Now, they don't have a big difference in, I guess their final destination, but the way they take there is somewhat different. And what does this mean, that he was an empiricist, a materialist, and an agnostic? Well, basically, he's really only focusing on everything physical. He doesn't believe in the supernatural at all. Which, going along with that kind of explains some of his political views. But it's also strange that he still thinks there should be religion and that it should be used as a tool. This is something that would influence Karl Marx later on, and as well as many other thinkers. What was Hobbes' view of power, desire, happiness, and more?